progress, visions for my first years of life in community. The first thing to do, while the collage is panning around its center region, is click on this button here. You will then get a window that pops up that says Turn Narration On. Please turn on narration. Then, please click on the Enter Full Screen button.
Working with highly skilled art therapists, I learned that my depression was bound up with how I process, comprehend, and learn about new events differently as an autistic person. At the time, I did not know very much about how I am different from what is considered normal, and how my differences create profound challenges for me. Through photography, I found a way of seeing myself, the world, and the misfit between us. Using digital collage, I began mapping my understandings, frustrations, hopes, and dreams. Collage allowed me, more than any other means of expression, to capture the complex and competing thoughts that were overwhelming me in a way that made sense. I gained the ability to capture and organize my thoughts visually, functionally, perceptually, and prioritize them in relation to each other. Clarifying my thoughts this way allowed me to understand my difference and recast my understanding of normal. My perceptions and experiences are not normal. They are valid, uncommon perhaps, but not wrong. This led to a deep and abiding commitment to dialogue, a way of seeking knowledge that recognizes multiple perspectives in dynamic synthesis rather than seeking to reduce everything to a single truth. To summarize this information, I find I engage in contemplative photography. In the process of practicing this type of mindfulness, I find I am able to temporarily escape the significant challenges I cope with daily, for a while at least, as I spend the time editing my images and creating my collage with my images. I find my sense of happiness and joy is able to replace the frustrations I need to manage daily.
Now that we have listened to the opening narration, I would invite us to start exploring the points of interest, which are these circles here. To find the first point of interest in this photosphere, we want to look toward the top of the photosphere for the sky, and then we will click on this point of interest. When we do, its narration will immediately start playing, and we will get a list popping up over here on the screen of all the other points of interest that we can explore in this photosphere.
What is now collage evolved from simple photographs, often of reflections, machines, nature, and landscapes. As I struggled with trying to use this basic imagery to support my self-advocacy efforts, I found I was increasingly trying to design a better way. With the help of art therapists, I quickly discovered I could design myself a solution. The solution I discovered was to design three-dimensional worlds, where each object was free to take on richly complex metaphor based on its application, design, cultural context, and/or manufacturing process. This basis I use to apply a design affordance, which is really an answer to the question, what else is this thing capable of doing? By exploring this question, I often raise others, both for myself and points of reflection for society more generally. As I spend time attempting to read and comprehend information about the topic, my metaphor grows more complex.
Now, there are two ways of moving between points. As you can see, these points don't have numbers on them in the photosphere themselves, but they do in this list over here. Because this is the only photosphere where it is important to get all the points in order, I suggest simply clicking on the next image icon that does not have a blue circle on it, and the scene will recenter itself around the next point of interest, like this.
Quickly, as I was experimenting with how to create my collage, I ran into challenges caused by my extreme struggles with math and the related comprehension difficulties I live with. This resulted in my abilities to create images where only some of the highest level information my imagery supported was visible. Still, I dream of getting to a point where either myself or with the support of another individual, I am able to create my alternative world in the true form where on one face of each photo object of mine I have placed in collage could have an image of the object on one face and text that would be, depending on the observer's point of view, read on each of the other faces, each face being either a reference citation to some information, my reflection on how the information on a related face of the object could help me, or an aspect of a challenge I struggle with that the information clarified in some way for me. I am fortunate enough that I have been able to find some simple ways of presenting this information. Unfortunately, I am frustrated by my available options to translate the metaphors I have separated in my collage to levels others can interact with. While a simple diorama is a good starting point, I quickly realized to invest the time physically creating the detail in them was not a good use of my time.
Okay, now we shall move on to the next point of interest. You will notice that as we move on, we are getting into a slightly different presentation of the points of interest. The points of interest from this point on will explore these paper cubes and why I chose to create them in a bit more detail, as well as some of the high-level content you will see in them in later scenes.
In the rest of the scenes in this collage tour, you will find cubes that look like this. For most cubes, I have provided a narration. In this monologue, I expand upon how the cube, in some way, supports a need or hope of mine for the future, or I reflect upon how one or more aspects of my lived experience as an autistic person could be influenced in a positive way if the idea was explored further. As you read the information I have placed on each face, I hope you will reflect upon these guiding ideas. On face number 1, I highlight the start point of the object's role in metaphor. I attempt to provide just enough information about my perception of how I normally run into the concept, which I then attempt to rationalize it with how I understand the idea currently in my own life. On phase number 2, I provide one or more qualities the object brings with it to the interaction it finds itself in. Often in this box, I will list the traits this idea supports. Of the many ideas, often human traits each object represents, in my metaphor, I have chosen 1, 2, or 3 that are most important to how I understand the conceptual object interacting with the objects around it. On face number 3, I place a reflection about how this object impacts the culture of the community I function in. I intend such a statement to be the start point of personal reflection about what experiences, events, customs, and challenges I have experienced. I hope at some level I have chosen dimensions of this experience that you might be able to identify with. On face number 4, I ask a question based on my in-depth observations of the normal uses of the object the image in the center of the cube cutout depicts. Often this is a group of objects that I have layered onto each other that create one image or one block of my collage. My invitation to your reflection is based on my most broad answer to a question generated from my answer to one of my very common questions. What would happen if, on face number 5, I try to list the part of the question that prompted me to create the content on faces 2, 3, and 4. As this is my attempt to summarize lots of competing information, I often choose the aspect that has the greatest immediate impact on my functionality. When it comes to my naming the object on face 6, I have chosen to name it for the concept it represents, not the name of the surface object which I picture and what its actual name is in our current society. I make this choice as most of the objects that hold this space in the cube are actually made up of a number of different objects. In the cubes I have placed in the image of my diorama, I was able to orient thoughts on the sides of the image object, the sides without color, in ways that relate to each other in the ways I see them in my original world. Unfortunately, this is not possible in a photosphere or this sort of 360-degree image, as we can only ever see one side. This realization means that rather than present my image points of interest as a complete cube, I needed to present them as a two-dimensional object. I have a challenging time describing the points of interest as two-dimensional objects without removing too many layers of meaning in my metaphor to leave my collage impossible to comprehend. I found a way to work with the cube idea, which I first explored in diorama form. This time, I thought about how both myself and my observations of how the idea is currently used in society. I end up with a lot of competing thoughts, often representing multiple points of view, which further describe the original metaphor of the object. Well, I hope one day to be able to present all these viewpoints. Right now, I realize it is enough to present my top 5 that represent the object and, at a high level, its interactions with other objects near it. While not the way I build my collage, I realized this idea could become a foundation for creative exploration of my collage in a new, possibly accessible format. Rather than present the objects as a complete cube, I have chosen to display them as a cube to be folded together. I made this choice as I wanted, in this way of interacting with my collage, to allow for the association of ideas that may or may not be as closely linked as I had originally thought. I hope my choice to do this leads to better outcomes for meeting my needs, as well as helps create the broadest understanding of all the ways I hope my intentional community can support me, and what core aspects could look like for people who need similar supports but choose not to live in an intentional community.
Now we shall briefly take a look at what a photosphere actually is, now that we have understood the journey I have taken to get to the point of creating a collage, and a little bit about what it started off as and where it has come.
Working with a diorama, I realized two things. The cube could be a good high-level bridge to a format that could allow me to develop an interim way of working with a diorama. I realized two things. The cube could be a good high-level bridge to a format that could allow me to develop an interim way of inviting people into my world until I can find a way of accurately creating my actual vision. Together with a photosphere, where I take my collage and project it onto the inside of an imaginary ball. This 360-degree image I am working with in this tour has caused me important challenges I want to overcome. The center region of my collage gets too squished together, making it hard to see what the images are clear enough in the middle, while objects around the edges are clearer and more easily separated. For this tour, I have been able to reduce the distortion to levels I can work with by presenting my collage in a number of blocks. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find a way of allowing one to experience any point of view other than the image face of the cube. This image is the same image I have used to create 3 of the first 4 scenes.
Okay, now we shall take a look at one more aspect of what some of the content is that is still at a very basic level.
In my collage, Reflections on My World, Visions for My Community, I created paper silhouettes of machines that I incorporated into my collage imagery by way of taking photographs of these silhouettes with their reflections. I used this technique to store strong feelings I am still struggling to identify. Well, I think these feelings I express using the paper shapes of skid steer loaders, compact track loaders, a trench compactor, and a street sweeper, among other pieces of heavy and compact equipment, primarily fall into the categories of anger, frustration, fear, and grief. I am not totally sure, as I am still struggling to comprehend the feelings I have explored in this way. I store these feelings in the reflections of these silhouettes to allow me the space to process them, to help me to try to make sense of these feelings for myself. On many of the silhouettes, I made simple drawings and even a few watercolor paintings. These images I created on these objects represent the joys, hopes, goals, achievements, and struggles within the areas represented by these cutout shapes. I find I am still reflecting on these issues as I continue working on my current collage, Visions for My First Years of Life in my community, as I have developed a deeper understanding and appreciation of some of these issues represented by paper silhouette. I realized some of them are personal biases of mine. Others, in addition to being personal biases of mine, I realize have an element of implicit bias to them. I am working through this exploration by collaging objects on top of these silhouettes. I hope when I am able to find a collage construction media that is more capable of allowing me to associate the faces of these objects with my related feelings and thoughts they represent than my current cube idea does. I hope I will be able to process them, accept them, and work to overcoming those that I realize I could do something about. For now, I am working with the visibility of the underlying image I used to create the silhouette to begin the process of differentiating personal from implicit bias, rationalize my feelings, sort bias from privileged, prejudgmental, or preferential belonging, and propose ways of reducing the ways that these conflicting ideas could overwhelm me less in the future. Unfortunately, because we can't zoom in on the collage blocks that form the photosphere in this virtual reality exploration of my collage, we will be somewhat limited in how much depth we can explore these ideas, issues, and a few of the possible solutions to the challenges I explore in this domain. In my current collage in progress, as I continue my self-directed learning, I realize I am starting to differentiate my feelings from the biases I hold, and what may be forms of implicit bias more generally, to help me try to actively sort these conflicts out. I have recruited other types of lifting equipment. In addition to cranes, if we were able to zoom in on this collage without it being distorted, as it is in this tour, we would come across forest machinery, excavators, drill rigs, and the skid steer and compact track loaders that are these silhouettes.
Now we shall move on to another thing that I include in all my scenes, and that is an orienting reflection. We will click on this point of interest now, and again we will observe that the photosphere will recenter itself on this point of interest.
To provide further context for interpreting the imagery, as I can't create the three-dimensional world as I envision when I create my collage, I have created drawing overlays of the scenes in my collage that I hope will help you, the interpreter, contextualize and understand what is happening in each block, where we explore the ways it could be related to what is happening around it. Often in my tour, I use these blocks to reflect upon how the ideas I explore in the scene more widely impact society, and some of the impacts and related learning I have done, which has provided me hope for my future. As with all blocks presented here, it is a work in progress. As with my entire collage, my hopes for my first years of life in community, the white spaces which appear as holes in this image will eventually be filled in.
Now we will take a look at two cubes that explore photographic elements that you will come across in multiple points in the rest of the scenes in the image. We're going to start by looking at lawnmowers. Now, you are going to notice that as you move the cube around in relation to how close you are to it, that it becomes easier to read the text in all of the squares. I will demonstrate this as we listen to its narration.
Many of the interconnected metaphors I explore in my collage involve some aspect of oversimplification. I do this so I can develop an appreciation for subtly different points of view and their related ideas as I work to compare and contrast these viewpoints and ideas with my lived experience as an invisibly disabled person. As I reconstruct these ideas, experiences, and related understandings of our world, I discovered I needed a broad category as a start point. To find such a start point, I picture myself as the owner of a large area of what started as a lawn that quickly turned into a highly varied landscape. When I was working with my first version of this metaphor in my collage, Reflections on My World, Visions for My Community, I thought carefully about how I would explain to a person who did not comprehend my comfortable, functional language. I thought about how I would ask them to look after my lawn. I realized I would have to explain seasonally, our grass is green. Green grass grows. This means we have to cut the grass every so often so it looks like the grass around it. My imagined land has many different types of grass on it, each one needing cutting on a different frequency, using a different sort of lawnmower. When I have helped them understand this concept, I then would move on to explaining how to safely use the appropriate lawn mowing machine. Ideally, I would demonstrate aspects of this for them, but most of it I would try to accomplish by using other ways of instruction, like narration, reading manuals for the machines, and a small amount of independent study. This process of learning would ideally have no end for the individual I had asked to help me look after my grass. Rather, over time, I would gain a better idea of how to support their safe use of the machinery by collaboratively caring for my land. I have come to understand my needs for supported choice making in a similar way. Observation is important for me to appreciate the actual nature of the choice I have. I need access to many ways of processing a given set of information. To begin, I find it is helpful to observe some of the aspects of a similar choice I face others have made. For this, I will spend time watching videos online. I would also find it helpful to observe parts of an active discussion in person. After I have done these for a bit, when I feel I understand the concept at a level similar to the person receiving my instruction in the lawnmower example, I would begin exploring for physical items that could support the choice in a way that is similar to how lawnmower operators prepare for the start of their shift. As I repeatedly communicate with my environment this way, I become more confident in the ways things normally happen. I realize when I need to make impactful choices for myself. Most of the time, I have available to me a participatory dialogue to help me make this choice. Often, though, such support is not offered to me because another may think I am fluent in the use of the process when I am not. I find when I need to reach for aspects of this way of interacting with my world, I reach for a lawnmower in my collage. As I continue working through my collage, visions for my first years of life in my community, I find I have adapted this metaphor to include both active choice-making as well as exploring aspects of the shared burden of equity. I am understanding this currently as one of the ways society chooses to restrict access to important states of being by asking those living with such burden to answer questions like, how can I trust my environment more? Why does individual trust not always lead to collective action? Who or what is responsible for creating the burden when they have the option of preventing this? How is this burden connected with my evolving understanding of free will?
Now we shall take a look at our last point of interest in the opening scene.
At many points, as I unpack my interconnected metaphor, I arrive at questions I can't answer for myself in ways that satisfy my wish to understand the idea in the depth I want to. When I am able to satisfy myself with a partial answer, it's often a question I find I am primarily able to answer with an uncomfortable judgment. When I reflect on this judgment, I realize I arrived at this point because it is how I understand choices we as a society make around resource allocation, collective priorities, differences of appreciative understanding, the degree to which I can accurately interpret the context, or false privilege of power. Usually, I discover multiple aspects of the ideas I listed are at play. I observe the ways they want to interact normally in situations are always opposite to the other, usually the majority of the supporting ideas. These tensions, or points of friction in my collage, I explore using cranes. The greater the number of these questions, the larger the crane's lifting capacity I use to represent this point. When these questions focus on one category, I use a tower crane. For multiple categories, all of which share some aspect in common, I will use a mobile or crawler crane.
Now that we have explored the audio and have developed one appreciation for how to navigate the photosphere, we will look at one of two additional points of interest. The first being, how do you transition between scenes? There are 9 in total, but 8 of which explore my vision for my first years of life in community. So to find them, down at the bottom of the screen, you will notice that there is this thing labeled scene and then a couple of arrows. If we click on the arrow pointing to the right, we will then end up in the second scene. Here again, when we enter the scene, it automatically starts panning around. We have over here the menu of what are the names of the points of interest. You will notice that unlike the last scene, I haven't numbered which order to visit these points of interest in, because I mean for us as a viewer and those who are interacting with in this collage to click on the points of interest at random. Now, when you first enter the scene, it will immediately point you to the opening reflection that helps you understand what is going on in the scene. So we will click on that right now, which can be found here in scene 2.
New opportunities to learn about my community, the environment that supports my communities of vocation, residents, and the society these exist in. I enjoy exploring, learning about, and reflecting on how language, context, and customary interactions shape my world. I realize many of the challenges I cope with, at some level at least, can be attributed to the ways society treats words like stereotype, stigma, and words that end in ism. I observe that such language creates a power imbalance by those who choose to use it. With this power imbalance comes extreme states of vulnerability. My lived experience is teaching me among the causes of this vulnerability are inequity, scarcity, lack of understanding, whether by choice or from a genuine curiosity, does not seem to matter for people who prefer such language, as their aim appears to have the same result, rather than invite these people who find them trapped by language into their world. The users of this language find excuses that perpetuate the vulnerability. I have chosen to reflect upon how my experience as a member of an invisibly disabled community is impacted by such a culture. While I know that the culture does not include everyone who uses such language, the aspects I want to more actively participate in are asking that I become comfortable functioning in these aspects of vulnerability. As I am choosing to learn about this aspect of our culture, I thought I would start with an aspect of our society that first introduced me to the harms of many of the ism words in our nation. I am slowly appreciating how my struggle for support, acceptance, value, and my need to belong share many similarities to that of our first peoples.
Now that we have finished hearing about the narration that this accompanied this image, we, rather than clicking on these over here, I invite you to simply grab a hold of somewhere in the photosphere and pan around the image and spend time allowing your eye to explore and reflect upon what kinds of things you're seeing, and when you come across another point of interest like this one over here, click on it, and again, we will find that it's easier to read by moving the image about.
Sensory perceptive challenges I cope with. I realize at a few levels, these challenges have created anxieties in me that are similar to phobias. My fears of healthcare-acquired infections are one such example. Another is being abandoned by the groups, individuals, and systems society tells me should look after me. Coping in the executive function domain, sensory perceptive domain, and cognitive communications domain simultaneously.
Now that we have gotten to the end of our tour, click on this button to exit full screen mode, and